Let's make some rings. I'll start with a torus. Click and drag. I'll use my attribute editor to move it right to the center of the world and slide it up onto the spindle. And on the third tab of the attribute editor, I can adjust these subdivisions. Let's go with 24 around the axis and maybe 16 on the height. That looks about right. Now we just need to adjust the radius to get about what we want. So I'm using a radius of 2 with a section radius of 1. I'm leaving a little bit of space in the center there. Actually, let's make that section radius 1.1, and we'll scale vertically a little bit to squash it down. Now I think that's about the right size. I just want to right click to assign the existing material, and I need to map this. So let's select all those faces, and I'll use automatic mapping, open my UV texture editor window, and it's broken that mapping into too many pieces. So that's not going to work. But if I've selected automatic mapping already, and then I choose planar mapping, I get this little manipulator in here that will help me see visually how that planar mapping is going to be projected onto the object. So I know I need to rotate it 90 degrees here to have it project straight down. And I can actually use this manipulator then, this rectangle, to stretch the projection to about the right size before I even go into my UV texture editor window. Now if I go there, into that window, I'll see here's the shell that I've got. We can scale that a little bit more just to get it right, and scale it down, move it over the red, and try to get it right into position. This is the top and bottom of that torus. Now it looks good, but one thing that I need to be attentive to is the fact that because this is a planar projection on a curved surface, we have some potential for distortion here. Since the texture is a fairly flat color, I don't notice that distortion, but it is happening. You see that these faces are more or less equidistant from each other here in the 3D view, but as we look in the 2D view, the planar projection has them getting a little closer to one another toward the perimeters. So one thing I can do is go to edge mode and double click my outer ring to select the outermost edge, and then here in the UV texture editor window I can scale that up to create a little more breathing room. Let me get the whole shell and scale it down. Same with this edge, I can scale that up a little bit. If I want to get both of them, I can select them in the 3D view and scale them up. Same with the center here, the center ring. I can select it either in the 3D view or in the UV window and scale it down toward the center. That should give me a little better distribution of my UVs for less stretching. Let's see it in lighted view. That looks pretty good. Now let's duplicate that ring and lift it up, but we need to scale it a little bit because each of these rings is going to get a little bit smaller as it goes up. And open the UV texture editor window. Now that this is already mapped, all I have to do is select those shells, move it down to the yellow, close that window. Then I should have my second ring. If I duplicate it again and lift it up, scale it down, maybe pinching down on that spindle a little bit too much, but it looks okay so far. Let's move it down into position, and in the UV texture editor window, select shell and move that over the blue. If I want to create that fourth ring, the green one, I may need to move that spindle up a little higher. So let's select that face, and we'll go ahead and lift that up a little bit more. There, now the spindle's a little bit longer. Now before I create that third ring, I noticed in my texture that I don't have a circle that's green. What I have is a rectangle. So this is a compromise that I've made to fit all the different colors onto this texture. The small ring has to be mapped differently. So I'm going to create a new torus from scratch so that I can utilize the default mapping of that torus. Use our attribute editor to adjust the subdivisions to 24 and 16 like we did with the other rings. We'll go back to this first tab and move it to the center of the world and lift it up into place. Now it looks like it's almost the right size, but I probably should scale it down a little bit. And I'll assign the same material. Now if I open up my UV texture editor window, I can see the default mapping for that torus is right here. Let's select that shell and scale it down to fit onto the green here. Now if I notice, that green section is actually a gradient that's lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. So if I want to take advantage of that in texturing my torus here, I need to make some adjustments. I'm going to select the highest edge loop that I can find and go ahead and separate the UVs along the selected faces using this scissors button. Now if I select this shell and flip it vertically, I can move it down into position. I've essentially folded the top quarter of this UV layout to move the lightest part of the texture onto the top of that ring. Same with the bottom edge. If I select the edge at the very lowest part, double click that, and in the UV texture editor window, separate those UVs. I can take that shell and flip it vertically, move it up into position, and now I have a fairly smooth transition from top to bottom, light to dark. And what I have is 3 separate shells, so I need to grab all of them and move them here and scale them up to fit into that texture a little bit better. Now I just have a little seam here where the green gradient ends and begins. I could try to use folding to get rid of that, or I can go in and try to fix it in my texture. I decided to go ahead and fold it, so that seam is now not as noticeable. Now I have 4 rings on this set. They're all separate objects. I could select them all and combine them to make them a single object, but if I'd rather keep them separate, I can also use Command G to create a group. Now, if I select any one of those objects that's part of the group and click the up arrow key, then I can move up to my group. And I can affect this by moving it, scaling it down because it's a little bit too big, rotating it, or whatever I want to do. So that right there is the ring toy. A little bit more difficult to make than you might have thought.